Our guest is Dr. William Anderson. Hello, Dr. Anderson. How are you doing?
Doing fine.
All right, then. So, we're on record, and I just hope that I'll be able to upload this video. So, Dr. Anderson, we're going to be talking about some of the articles that you recently wrote for Mises. And one article is titled, Why Empowering Organized Labor Will Definitely Not Help the Economy. Paul Krugman has a very prominent perch from the editorial page at the New York Times, and he has used his influence, among other things, to shield for two things that are anatem, anatem, anathema to a strong economy: inflation and organized labor. Dr. Anderson, who is Paul Krugman?
Paul Krugman is an economist who was he writes for the New York Times. He received the Nobel Prize in economics in 2008, and it was ostensibly for his trade theories. He uh, dealt with issues of what we call the concept of free trade versus managed trade and the like. And so uh, uh, and so what he did was, but he mostly wrote his columns, against George Bush. He's very much what I would call um, a how is how do we say it? He's let's just say that Paul Krugman is very much a shill for the left, and he's very much a partisan, and so. And the problem, of course, that a lot of us have is that if you write as a uh, as a political partisan, you should not then try to say, "Well, I'm invoking my academic credentials," because generally speaking, we know that partisan politics, the first casualty of partisan politics is going to be the truth, because you're trying to spin the facts and all that as as a way to promote a certain political candidate. And so Krugman does that a lot, and unfortunately, he's got a bad habit of it. So he's probably he was listed as the most influential economist in the world, and that's because uh, he has the political establishment on his side, and also that like I said, when you're at the New York Times, that's a very, very prominent place to be writing from. And so he's highly influential, but that doesn't just because he's influential doesn't mean he's right.
Okay, all right. So Paul Krugman is known for many of his insights, in particularly research that he did on productivity and Asia years ago. But you are absolutely correct. Paul Krugman is an op-ed columnist. He writes for the New York Times, and he often uses his prestige as an economist to support shaky characters like AOC.
Yeah, yeah. His like I said, he's basically in fact, I think around 2002, I wrote in an article. I said he really wasn't an economist, and instead I said what he is uh, he's a political partisan, and he writes. I said political operative. I think was the term I used, and that yeah his and it's an interesting combination because in the academic world, as you know, there is supposed to be some stepping back and observing. In other words, and especially if you're talking about issues where science is involved, what you say, you step back and you say, okay, this is what we observed, and but you never ever say, I absolutely am going to you know, take this position. You have to be very careful when you speak about absolutes, especially when you're speaking of particular legislation. Okay, and that and you're trying to promote legislation. Now you can do that, but you have to be very careful when you use your academic credentials to do it, because um, that we always leave room in the academic world for something else, some other phenomenon to occur that maybe we hadn't counted on. But Krugman he'll shill for inflation, he'll shill for rent control, all of price controls, all sorts of things. That, by the way, economists say if you do these things, you may run into problems, and here are certain problems you're going to run into. And Krugman's response is that, well, this is just what right wing economists say. So he doesn't, and there's a whole body of literature that may actually contradict that, but it doesn't matter, because what he does is he uses an insult, and that's supposed to end all discussion.
Now we're going to get to the essence of the essay and talk about organized labor. What is organized labor?
Organized labor, basically, it's where you take workers and they become part of an organization in a work that, and this organization represents the workers. It engages in what you call collective bargaining. That is, that it bargains for the unit as a whole. Okay, so therefore, laborers now, their first allegiance is not to their employer, not to their to the company where they work, but rather to the union. All right, and so that you have, and so that it's the union that speaks to the company on behalf of the employees. And now in the United States, organized labor is protected by law, and in fact, to be honest, that the law favors organized labor. And that's something a lot of people don't realize, because they keep thinking that the law is against organized labor. But if you look at, the all the way going all the way back to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935, that the government very much has been in labor unions. And so, but anyway, labor unions also tend, because they get their power and their authority from the state, then they're, of course, by design, going to be entities. And so that's in a secondary aspect. They're the ones that help get certain candidates elected or not elected. Uh, so that's the other aspect of labor unions.
So we're going to debunk some of the myths proffered by Krugman in his article published by the New York Times. And you write, citing Krugman, America used to have a powerful labor movement. Union membership soared between 1934 and the end of World War II. During the 1950s, roughly a third of non-agricultural workers were union members. As late as 1980, unions still represented around a quarter of the workforce, and strong unions had a big impact even on non-union workers, setting pay norms and putting non-union employers on notice that they had to treat their workers relatively well, l- lest they face an organizing drive. And you argue that Paul Krugman is partially correct. Why is he only partially correct?
Well, that indeed, that historically the labor movement was probably overly powerful for a couple of reasons. Okay, what he's doing, he's looking back, and by the way, I'm going to preface this by saying that Krugman tends to have a historicist view of things, but then he doesn't recognize, and he'll say, well, at this time we had this set of circumstances, and that's why something happened. But he refuses to do that with organized labor. All right, let me explain. First, that you had the government clearly coming into into favoring organized labor in the 1930s, after the Supreme Court in around 1936 or 37 upheld the Fair Labor Standards Act as being constitutional. And that was, by the way, the court did that under threat from Roosevelt because Roosevelt had already launched a plan to pack the court, with his cronies. And so he was, and so they were sort of playing defense, I guess, after that. But that the government came on the side of labor unions and pretty much said that companies that don't allow their workers to organize, we are not going to intervene, especially if these unions start destroying property or even killing people or whatever. That we're simply just going to stand by, let them do whatever they want. That was the first thing. Okay, and the second thing, World War II came around. All right, and in the and at that point, now the only game in town ended up being making war production. And so companies, if you wanted to be able to stay in business during the Second World War, you had to pretty much do business with the federal government. And the government was very interested in using that as a cudgel to force employers to recognize labor unions. And so a lot of companies, allowed their workers to organize. And so the union movement swelled during the Second World War. And of course, in the aftermath, the United States is one of the few countries left standing. And so its industries were intact. And so the unions were there, and it went on into the 1950s. But what Krugman doesn't point out is that even in the 1950s, private labor union membership begins to fall. And what they try to say is, oh, we had labor unions really powerful. Then Ronald Reagan fired the striking air traffic controllers in 1981, and then all of a sudden the entire organized labor movement fell apart. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, just step back and look at a second that a small union, he put that union out of business, but what they were doing was trying to tie up the entirety of U.S. passenger and freight air service, and so that was causing a lot of problems. But and also was illegal. It was against the law for federal employees, members of a union, not to strike against the federal government, and so he. But nonetheless, that in fact, over those years, private labor union membership already was falling. And, in other words, the trend began long before you had any kind of true conservative government, like, Ronald Reagan's government, or whatever, long before that happened. I mean, what you had with the, in fact, while I'm doing it, I'm going to look that up. Just, I'm very, very curious to see what we have here. Well, I'm all of a sudden, look at this. I mean, we're looking at, I've all of a sudden pulled up some images here, and labor union membership almost immediately it starts to fall. And I mean, we're talking even here starting in, it was falling for a long period of time before the Reagan presidency. The trend, it had shot upward all the way in through the 1950s, and in the 60s it hit a peak and it started to fall. Okay, and this is long before Reagan became president. So in other words, that to claim that somehow it was Ronald Reagan that undid organized labor is simply just not true. Um, and so and it wasn't, because now you did have the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948, which said that if it's legal in a state, you can have a right to work state. That is that some states, and some states have it. California does not, for example. Maryland does. I don't think Maryland is a right to work state. Probably Pennsylvania would not be. And that is, if you have a union if your company is unionized, you have to join the union. Whereas right to work states, you don't have to join the union. But even then, and they'll say, it's right to work has undermined labor unions. But think about it. If labor unions are doing all of these great things for workers, why would workers not want to be part of it? Why in the world, if labor unions can raise everybody's standard of living, if it can make you wealthier and whatnot, why in the world would you resist? Why in the world would you not be a member of a union? And that they don't address that, other than, well, companies are using unfair tactics. But look, I have been through a number of situations. I went years ago. I was executive director of the Chattanooga Manufacturers Association, and I saw decertification elections. I saw what happened with companies, with unions, and companies where the workers voted not to unionize, or they voted to decertify their union. And that was not done with company pressure. You could see that. Nobody was saying, you better do that or you're fired. It was workers themselves did not trust the unions. And so I think that Krugman, he's not being entirely honest. Yeah, if you are in a labor union and you're represented by a union, you may it may benefit you individually. It may, I say, but then it may not, because unions engage in collective bargaining, and nobody in an organization wants to be too good. They don't want their heads to rise too much above everybody else, because the union makes sure that it gets chopped down. That's another thing about it. That unions operate collectively, and that means that ultimately, by the way, you see what happens with police unions, right? No matter how outrageous the conduct, the unions will argue, that the police officer, no matter how bad his conduct, should be allowed to keep his job. So,
Professor Anderson,
yeah.
what's a bit unusual about this discourse between both of us is that we do know that the literature on the negativities of unions is overwhelmingly against unionization.
Yeah.
So it's surprising that we're not citing some of these studies. But Ryan McMakin, in one of his articles, he cited a study noting that the Rust Belt declined in a sense because of unionization.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Unions, one of the things that happen, let's think about what a union does, okay? That a union will hold a company hostage. And what I mean by hold them hostage, they will um, they will say, okay, if you don't agree to our demands, we will strike, and we will prevent anybody from coming through. So we'll make it very hard for you to do business. And when you do that, okay, essentially what you're doing is you're holding the company hostage. You're saying that, and by the way, we'll do property damage. We may even kill some of your folks and get away with it. And so therefore, um, that companies, they may not, they may not appreciate that. But here's the thing, okay? If you once you do that, and especially if you make it more difficult for firms to be able to capitalize, let's look at General Motors, for example. General Motors, for years, thanks to all sorts of agreements with the unions, paid all of the healthcare costs, not only to current employees, but also to retirees. And my throat's a little bit scratchy. I apologize. But okay, and they did that, and this healthcare cost went up and up and up. GM found that it was its largest bill was the healthcare bill, and ultimately they could not sustain that. They ended up with the highest labor costs of any of the automakers, and so ultimately, when they went bankrupt and the Obama administration reorganized them, that was out. And so the from then on, hey, guess what, fellas? Everybody's got to do Medicare like everybody, all the other retirees.
Professor Anderson, let's be simple and lucid. The essence of the argument is that unions are unable to appreciate trade offs. As Thomas Sowell often states, there are no solutions, only trade offs.
Yeah,
So unions are not thinking about the long term. So if you increase benefits within the next 5 or 10 years, workers may lose their jobs. Let me give a perfect example. The company is profitable, but within the next 5 or 10 years, the company has responded unfavorably to a global economic shock. So
yeah,
maybe if those benefits were not increased, the company would have had funding to provide a cushion against the shock. Unions
yeah.
do not think long term. And the paper Ryan McMakin cites is titled The Decline of the US Rust Belt, a macroeconomic analysis.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's very true. And in fact, what happens is that um, with the way that the labor unions work, they are always short term. And so very few of them were willing to say, what we can't do is cripple the company in the long run, and which is what they ultimately did. One of the things that happened, you talk about, with around the late 70s into the early 80s. I mean, whole industries just seemed all of a sudden to be shutting down. Like Pittsburgh at one time, 7 miles of steel mills and related industries along the banks of the rivers there. And we're talking about 7 consecutive miles. That is an incredible, conglomerate of. But what occurred was that companies just were not. Their capitalization did not keep up, and so once once they started going up against lower cost competitors who were much better capitalized, they couldn't compete. But all that time, I mean, the unions, their attitude was, hey, this is U.S. Steel, this is General Motors, they don't go out of business. And I remember one time, this is 40 years ago, seeing it was regarding a uh, publications in New York City, and somebody asked the union guy, um, "Hey, what if you force up costs and they can't afford to pay them and they can't be profitable?" And he said, "Hey, I wouldn't be want to be the one to for this to have this company go out of business." But what they meant was that, hey, they'll just keep sustaining losses. They should just sustain losses because they are the whatever the name of the publication was, and they just shouldn't let themselves go out of business. Well, and I saw this in Chattanooga years ago with a newspaper papers. They had unions in it, and the unions The paper was not profitable, and what they believed was that, well, look, that the Sulzberger family, which owned the newspaper, which also was the New York Times, major family there, the Sulzbergers have a big trust fund, and they'll just keep the paper afloat by going into their trust fund. And what they found out was, no, they won't go into their trust fund to keep this thing afloat. And so they closed down a lot of their operations. And once that happened, everything changed, and so they don't. Yeah, it's very, very difficult to get to understand the concept of what we call opportunity cost, which is another term for trade-offs. Opportunity cost simply is, for every action that you take like that, you have to give up something. What happened? Okay, what are you going to give up? What is going to be the consequence of giving up something? And so, yeah, with the unions, they don't seem to have that. That doesn't exist here. It's like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has no concept at all of what a cost is. He thinks it's just a monetary outlay, and you print money and you cover the outlay, and that's how you deal with costs. Well, in the real world, that's not what goes on. But in Bernie Sanders' world, that's what happens.
Do you know what's the problem with many in the economic community today? They don't appreciate the role of information in stimulating solutions and trade-off. And do you know why this is the case? Because they are not Austrians. Well, you don't have to be an Austrian to be a good economist, but the Austrian economics gives primacy to the role of individual actors and information, especially information asymmetries.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. The thing about, that in the typical mainstream, the idea is this, that um, information asymmetries are somehow become institutionalized, and that what they forget is that information itself is an economic good. The For whatever reason, and I don't know how this got into the thinking of the economics profession, but was that in a market setting, that we all have perfect information. So we assume perfect information, and if we don't have perfect information, that is due to a market failure. All right. And if you have a market failure, then government must intervene, because by definition, a market failure means that the problem cannot be solved by the market. Right. And so but in the Austrian view, and this, by the way, came the other other school, like the Chicago school, started, and UCLA, Armin Algernon started accepting the idea of information as a good in and of itself, and that you always would have imperfect information. So the question would be, how far do you go in order to get perfect information? The other thing that they pointed out was that government is no more equipped to deal with information asymmetries than the market. I mean, what makes you think that a government agent somehow has all this access to perfect information? That's not the case. And in fact, they're probably going to be more ignorant of what needs to be done than somebody who actually makes a living in that line. And so, unfortunately, information asymmetries, that it sort of hit its peak around 1970, when George Akerlof published the book, on lemons, and what we call the famous lemons paper, and 30 years later he got a Nobel Prize for it. But the notion there was that somehow markets will just break down altogether because you have a lemons problem. And the point that I made was that unless you've got some sort of institutional situation in which you've got the law preventing information, correct information, or you have a situation where it doesn't matter, where a person can be rewarded for bringing false information, then yeah, you're going to have a problem. But that's where it gets institutionalized, and almost always, if not always, it's government that institutionalizes the problem. I published a paper a few years ago in which I argued that if prosecutors and police, if they're protected by immunity, and if prosecutors are rewarded for getting convictions, then you're going to have what we call Lemon's problem or information asymmetry problem when prosecutors bring information forward. Because you have no idea if the information from what, just because they bring it there doesn't mean it's true. And because they are rewarded if they get a conviction, but they're not punished thanks to immunity, not statutes, but immunity policies that were created by the courts, that therefore, because they're protected by immunity, they don't have to worry about consequences. And so you're going to see dishonest people self-selecting into these positions over time, and you're going to have unreliable information. But that's where you institutionalize the problem. But Austrians point out that in a market setting, that there is in fact no reason whatsoever for this kind of information to be institutionalized. It's not that in fact that the markets always will break down any resistance to people finding out what is the truth about something.
Professor Anderson, are perfect markets favorable? This is the question we should be pondering. Perfect perfect markets cannot sustain the dynamism of capitalist innovation. We should actually be celebrating market failure. As I have stated on a number of occasions, market failure is significant because market failures show us what can work and what will not work. Someone who's truly interested in facilitating innovative markets should not prefer perfect competition.
No, I mean, and perfect competition is you would have if we had true perfect competition, you'd always have gridlock because and by the way, you wouldn't have any profits because how in the world? I mean, profits would be instantly competed away, and you would. In fact, you don't want to have costless entry and exit into and especially costless entry into a market that because that there need to be filters because what we're talking about is the allocation of scarce resources where we're talking about labor and capital and natural resources and the like. And so you need to have those things that are going to tell you what's going to be profitable and what is not. And in fact, that perfect information is not feasible. So that's the first thing that goes. Now, the concept of perfect, pure competition or perfect competition originally it was not started out as some sort of ideal to which markets should be applied, but rather that it started out as the sort of thing, kind of like in science, you say, okay, an object falls at 32 feet per second squared. Uh, but where does that happen? It happens at sea level in a vacuum. Well, most things don't drop, we don't live in a vacuum. And so you're going to have some deviation from that, but that does not mean conceptually that that concept was wrong. And that they'll use, it's like Murray Rothbard would use, like Mises used the concept of the evenly rotating economy for to lay out sort of some thought experiments as to how we look at what's going on. So and so Rothbard, it was sort of their version of general equilibrium, and so but the truth is that you don't have to, I mean, that the perfect competition, well, a lot of people, let me backtrack. what we hear from the critics when we say is, look, markets only work, prices only work, all this stuff only works if you have perfect competition and if you have all these particular um, conditions. And if any of these conditions are not met, why then government has to intervene because you're going to have market failure, and market failure is bad. But what happens, you're right, in what happens when we don't have enough information to make something, you go out and get more of it. And now you make the choice. Do we, you know, do we incur the costs of getting more information? Um, Even if we do, will this idea be profitable? And so, and ultimately, it's and we don't know. A lot of times we don't. That's the thing with entrepreneurs; they operate in a world of uncertainty, and uncertainty is going to mean that we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. We're not looking at probabilities; we're looking at unknown outcomes. And so, right there is that you have the imperfections. And in fact, in a market setting, you really you don't want perfect uh, things because you'll have instant gridlock. Uh, if you
I have
get a
an Professor Anderson, I have another point. Socialists. If you're
yeah
a socialist, you want a planned market or a perfect market. So the people who actually affirm perfect markets are socialists, central planners.
well, that's an interesting point
Yeah, that's
that
how I look at it because if
yeah
remember, markets must fail. Information is imperfect, and the socialist wants the control for failure. He fears failure.
yeah yeah. And what happens is that and that is their idea, that what you're going to do is you're going to plan everything out, and then everything is just going to work smoothly. All resources will go exactly where we planned them to go. There will be no little hitches. Everything will, and hey, they do it mathematically, right? They've already solved their simultaneous equations problems. And that's what Soviet planners used to do, by the way. They would set up these huge matrices of with uh, um, with these simultaneous equations. They'd solve them using matrix algebra, and then it was all these pristine models, these perfect models. But once you got into the economy, it didn't work that way. I mean, at all. And so which is why they always had shortages of things. They just you didn't know when something was coming in. And yeah, it was their version of a perfect competition or perfect markets. Yeah, they and that came, by the way, from Oscar Lange back in the
Yes, the
in
great socialist debate.
yeah, in the calculation debate. And what they said was, well, of course we can calculate. But what they did was they just made an assumption. We assume this, we assume that. And because we assume it, therefore it must be true. And that's pretty good, And I'm trying to sell my house right now. And, realtor's coming over today. I mean, I guess I should assume that it's worth $1 million, right?
Well, real estate usually appreciates.
Well, I hope it does in this case. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get for it what I paid for it in 2007. That's so. This market got hit very, very hard, in 2007 and 2008, and never really recovered. Uh, Other places,
Professor
uh,
Professor Anderson,
yeah.
Joe Biden is being praised for his management of the economy. But is it Joe Biden or institutions? It is evident that, irrespective of the person in power, with the exception of the Carter years, the American economy will bounce back. And why is this the case? Is it a consequence of employment law in America? It's easy to hire and fire workers.
Well, I think that any kind of you have a market system, and a market system to a certain extent is going to operate um, outside the political system. That people what happen the political system tends to throw barriers at at producers. Or what they try to do is they try to hook in, and basically, so you have unproductive people trying to commandeer some of the money being made in a market setting, and they try to redirect some of that to themselves. That's really what a lot of it's about. Um, but I mean, I will tell you that the American economy to me is incredibly resilient. I think probably the internet has a lot to do with that because information travels so quickly. And as long as you can still keep, organized capital markets and the like. But I'm afraid this particular administration is doing some long term damage. First, it's targeting the oil and gas industries, and it's trying to starve them of capital, and it does that by monitoring funds and investments by different groups, and basically the idea is to harass them, make it difficult for them to want to invest in oil and in these energy industries. And when that becomes the case, okay, you're going to start seeing capital deterioration of capital and the like. And that's one reason why gasoline and oil and gasoline prices are so high. The Biden supporters are saying, "Look, it's just supply and demand. President doesn't have anything to do with it." Well, here's my point: when the president is threatening future supplies, and he's threatening to jail oil executives over climate change, when they're threatening to destroy an entire industry, and they make no bones about it, they want this industry to disappear, then yeah, it's going to have an effect on current prices because you're looking at future supplies, you're looking at things down the road. And so one of the ways that the markets adjust to that is to raise prices of those goods at the present time. So that's playing a bigger role than what the Biden administration was.
Yeah, on the issue of the environment and climate change, this administration unfortunately affirms the fallacious reasoning of some on the left.
Yeah,
Scientism is this: within the next 10 years, the world will end. According to the Real Science Review of Geophysics, climate catastrophism is unlikely.
yeah, yeah. And I'm not a climatologist. I've got obviously background. I've got training in the area of statistics, which is what they use. But I would not consider myself to be a statistician by any means. But But what happens is they establish a narrative, and everything now feeds the narrative. Like those recent tornadoes we had in Kentucky. The idea, well, somehow this was caused by climate change. Well, why? I mean, you've had heat waves and droughts throughout history, and you in California, they've mismanaged forest lands for years and years and made it more difficult to to fight fires once they start, and they also made the forest much more combustible, um, through their lack of land management uh, processes. And so when you are going to have conflagrations when you have a situation like that, especially look in California in normal times, um, in a lot of the state, it stops raining sometime in March or maybe early April, and it doesn't rain again until the fall. And so you have it's very rare, extremely rare that you get rainfall during that period. And now they're getting rainfall and snow in the mountains, and like this, which is normal at this time of year. But and so you're going to have extremely hot and dry conditions. That is the way it has always been in California. Um, and that there was never a time when California was something else. That's the way things are there, and you have to make the adjust. So what do the Democrats say? They say, oh, well, to solve this problem, we'll make people drive electric cars. That'll solve everything. And you just say, oh, really? How much of an effect will that actually have on temperatures and on all that? It'll have zero effect. It won't have any effect at all. Um, but they will have, been successful in restricting people's freedoms, which is one of the things that they really want to do. Progressives have always had, a hate affair with individual liberty. I mean, this goes back to Woodrow Wilson, his writings in the late 1800s. I mean, they hated the Constitution, they hated individual rights, they hated all that, and believed in a form of collectivism. So it's nothing new. It's that you're seeing. It's always been applied this way.
So, Professor Anderson,
Yeah.
yeah, so we're going to wrap up, but before we do so, I have an additional point to convey. In your article, you also note that during the Clinton years, unions also declined.
Yeah.
So again, it was shattering another myth. And secondly, you're buying a home. You're a professor. Are you a professor or professor emeritus?
Well, right now, professor, for 2 more weeks. They recommended me for emeritus. They got it started a little bit too late. So if I get emeritus, it'll be sometime in the spring semester. Probably, and that probably will happen. But right now, I'm still professor for two
Okay,
more
so
weeks.
we're going to talk about retirement and retirement savings. So on Market Watch, retirees or are people who are about to retire. Prospective retirees are always lamenting that they're not saving enough, even when they have saved millions.
Yeah.
So personally, I think the issue is that the cost of living obviously is expensive in America because it's a developing country. When you compare tertiary education in Jamaica and restaurant prices in Jamaica to America, Jamaica is cheaper. So for those of you who would like to retire, maybe you should retire somewhere in the Caribbean or Mexico.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of people do that.
Yeah.
People retire, uh, and my wife and I have talked about that. The problem is that her daughter has health issues that she really
Okay.
has to stay in California. But you're absolutely right that a place like California, which is where I'll be living starting in a couple of weeks permanently. I mean, yeah, it's not very friendly to retirees at all. Places like New York, the same way. Um, but yeah, I would. We talked about that. There are a lot of Americans live in Mexico. I mean, in Latin
Robert
America.
Higgs. Robert Higgs. Didn't he migrate to Mexico?
Who? Robert. Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. He's up on on the coast in the Yucatan, and they part of it was financial, part of it was political. He just wanted to get out of the USA, and so they built an incredible house over there, and kind of an off the grid place. Um, he's got to watch out. He said jaguars like to come around every once in a while, so they have to be careful. But it's been an interesting experience for him. But he seems to be doing well with it, um, and yeah, but you have whole expat communities all over Latin America. I was in Guatemala City several years ago, and there was a pretty large expat community there.
Yeah, but the cost of living in Barbados has a higher cost of living than Jamaica. The posh communities in Jamaica
Yeah,
are really prestigious and famous. When you live in any of these communities, you're insulated from crime and violence. And in rural Jamaica, there are always opportunities to create Airbnb. So maybe you could think about buying an Airbnb. That would
yeah.
be profitable.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it really depends. I mean, like one of the problems of leaving any of these places in the country is that you're limited on when you can come back because of tax issues. But also, like if you have children and grandchildren, being able to to see them. For some people that's very important. But what you are seeing, for example, people moving into places like Florida and Texas, Tennessee, um, and states that don't have income taxes. Nevada is seeing a lot of new people moving in, and so to a certain extent, what you have is sort of the expats, American expats, and they're going into moving into those places
Yeah,
where where they're not, where the cost of living. I'll be honest, we could live in Tennessee. Talked about it, we would probably save at least $40,000 a year, maybe more than that, by living. But I said it's special circumstances that keep us in California.
yeah. I don't. You don't have to migrate to California. You don't need to relocate to Latin America, but you could always invest in the Airbnb idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
that. But the
Yeah.
cost of living in California is really expensive.
Ooh, ooh, baby. I mean, it's high. Oh my gosh. I mean, that 9.3 income tax rate kicks in really early. Damn.
Mm. But it has been a pleasure speaking to you, William. But unfortunately, I have to go. So bye.
Well, thank you very much. You take
All right,
care.
yeah, you too. Bye. Yeah.